There are moments when we discover that our survival hinged on something we never knew existed, when we learn that the difference between living and dying was determined by a choice someone else made that we were completely unaware of, and when the ordinary boundaries between life and death seem to blur in ways that defy our understanding of how the world works. Sometimes what saves us is not the equipment or training or protocols we rely on, but something far more mysterious and personal, something that connects us to others in ways we cannot explain but cannot deny. These are the stories that challenge our assumptions about chance and fate, that remind us we are all connected in invisible ways, and that sometimes the most important things in life are the ones we cannot see or measure, but can only feel and know to be true. If you believe that human connections transcend physical presence, that love can manifest in ways that seem impossible, and that survival sometimes depends on forces beyond our comprehension, hit that like button and subscribe for stories that explore the mysterious boundaries between the explainable and the miraculous, between science and something deeper that science cannot fully capture. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, United States Air Force retired, walked onto the Family Feud stage during Veterans Week at age 56, looking fit and composed despite the fact that careful observers might notice he walked with a very slight limp that became more pronounced when he moved quickly. He was accompanied by his wife Jennifer, their two adult sons ages 28 and 26, who had both followed their father into military service, though in different branches, Marcus's sister Diana, who had been his closest confidant since childhood, and his mother Grace, who at 79 years old remained sharp and energetic. Steve Harvey greeted the Chen family with his customary warmth, immediately drawn to Grace, who despite her age carried herself with remarkable vitality. Steve made gentle jokes about whether Grace was really old enough to be anyone's mother, earning her delighted laughter and creating the light atmosphere that typically characterized the beginning of Family Feud episodes during Veterans Week. Steve turned his attention to Marcus, thanking him for his service as was customary with military guests and asking the standard questions about his career. "Colonel Chen," Steve said, "tell us about your time in the Air Force. What did you fly?" Marcus's response was straightforward and professional, stating that he had been a fighter pilot flying F-16s for most of his career spanning 30 years, that he had flown combat missions during multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, that he had commanded fighter squadrons, and had eventually served in strategic planning roles before his retirement 5 years ago. Steve nodded with visible respect, clearly impressed by the distinguished career Marcus was describing. 30 years as a fighter pilot, Steve said. "That is incredible. You must have some stories from all those years in the cockpit." Marcus smiled slightly. "I have a few stories, Mr. Harvey. Some I can tell and some I cannot, as is typical with military service." The game began with the usual energy, both families competing well and demonstrating good knowledge of survey answers. The Chen family showed excellent teamwork, with Marcus proving to be strategically smart in his answers, Jennifer contributing strong responses to questions about family and relationships, the sons bringing contemporary knowledge to questions about current trends, Diana showing impressive general knowledge across categories, and Grace surprising everyone with her quick wit and her unexpectedly accurate answers to questions about younger generations. The family advanced through the rounds steadily, and they reached the fourth round needing 48 points to win and advance to fast money. The question Steve posed seemed innocuous at first, the kind of question that typically generated straightforward answers about faith, family, or fortune. Steve read from his card. "We surveyed 100 people and asked them to name something that can save your life when you are in danger." Marcus won the face off against the opposing team captain with the answer, "seat belt," which appeared on the board as the number 2 response worth 29 points. The Chen family chose to play, confident they could find the remaining answers. Jennifer went next with "phone to call for help," which was the number 1 answer at 36 points. Their older son contributed "first aid kit," which was the number 4 answer with 16 points. Their younger son offered "knowing CPR," which was the number 5 answer at 11 points. Diana suggested "having a weapon," which was not on the board, giving the family their first strike. The board had one answer remaining, and Grace took her turn with faith in God, which Steve clearly expected to be on the board, given that they were in the American South during a religious holiday season. But it was not on the board, giving the family their second strike. The rotation returned to Marcus, who now stood one wrong answer away from giving the opposing team a chance to steal and win the game. Steve approached Marcus at the podium with his typical game show energy. "Colonel Chen, we need you to come through here. We have one answer left on the board. Name something that can save your life when you are in danger. What do you think?" Marcus stood silent for a long moment, and Steve initially thought he was simply trying to think of the right answer. But as the seconds stretched out, Steve recognized that something more complex was happening. Marcus's expression had shifted from concentration to something deeper and more troubled, as if the question had triggered something internal that he was wrestling with. His wife Jennifer, standing with the rest of the family, watched her husband with visible concern, clearly recognizing signs in him that indicated he was experiencing something beyond normal game show pressure. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying undertones of emotion that had not been present in his earlier answers. "The voice of someone who is already gone can save your life when you are in danger, Mr. Harvey. If you can hear them clearly enough, if you can listen to what they are trying to tell you, their voice can guide you to safety even when they are no longer physically present." The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey froze, his expression shifting from entertainment mode to genuine confusion and concern. The audience sat utterly still, sensing they were witnessing something significant, but not yet understanding what Marcus was trying to communicate. Steve spoke carefully. "Colonel Chen, I am not sure I understand your answer. Are you saying that hearing someone's voice can save your life? Can you explain what you mean by that?" Marcus took a deep breath, and when he began speaking, it became clear that he had been holding this story inside for a long time and that Steve's question had opened a door he had kept carefully closed. 12 years ago, I was shot down over Afghanistan during a close air support mission. My aircraft took a surface-to-air missile hit that destroyed my left engine and damaged my control systems. I ejected from the aircraft at approximately 8,000 feet altitude over hostile territory in Helmand Province. The ejection sequence worked correctly, and I survived the initial bailout, but I sustained injuries during the ejection, including a fractured ankle and a dislocated shoulder. I landed in a valley about 30 miles from the nearest coalition forward operating base, in an area known to be controlled by Taliban forces. The studio audience was completely absorbed in Marcus's story, everyone understanding they were no longer watching a game show, but were instead hearing first-hand testimony about survival under extreme circumstances. Marcus continued, his voice becoming more intense as he relived the experience. "I activated my emergency beacon immediately after landing, and I knew that rescue forces would be coming for me, but I also knew it would take time for them to reach my position, and that Taliban fighters would be looking for me. I had my survival kit with basic supplies, my service weapon, and my training. I found cover in a rocky area, and I started moving toward higher ground where I would be more visible to rescue helicopters, and where I could defend myself more effectively if I encountered enemy forces. I was injured, in severe pain, and I was starting to go into shock from the trauma of the shoot, down and ejection. And that is when I heard my daughter's voice." Steve looked confused. "Your daughter's voice? Was she on your radio? Did rescue forces have her on communications?" Marcus shook his head. "No, Mr. Harvey. My daughter Emily was not on any radio. My daughter Emily had died 3 years before I was shot down, killed in a car accident when she was 16 years old." The revelation hit the studio like a physical force. Steve Harvey stood absolutely frozen, his mouth slightly open, completely speechless as he processed what Marcus had just said. The audience gasped collectively, many people immediately beginning to cry. Marcus's family members on stage, who clearly knew this story but perhaps had never heard Marcus tell it publicly, gathered closer together, with Jennifer reaching out to hold her husband's hand. Marcus's voice remained steady despite the tears that were now streaming down his face. "Emily died 3 years before that mission, but in that valley in Afghanistan, I heard her voice as clearly as I am hearing yours right now. She was telling me which direction to move, warning me about enemy fighters who were searching for me, telling me where to hide when they got close. She was guiding me through that valley for 4 hours until the rescue helicopter reached my position. Every decision I made during those 4 hours was based on what I heard Emily telling me to do. Steve finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Colonel Chen, are you saying that you believe your deceased daughter's spirit was communicating with you? Marcus met Steve's eyes directly. I am saying that I heard my daughter's voice, giving me specific tactical information that I used to evade capture and survive until rescue arrived. I am saying that I followed instructions I heard in her voice, and those instructions kept me alive. I am saying that when the rescue helicopter finally picked me up and I was being treated by the pararescue team, the first thing I said was to thank Emily for bringing me home. The medics thought I was delirious from shock and pain. The psychiatrists I was required to see after the incident thought I had experienced an auditory hallucination triggered by extreme stress and grief. But I know what I heard. I know my daughter was with me in that valley, and I know that her voice saved my life. The studio remained in complete silence, everyone struggling to process this testimony from a rational, highly trained military officer who was describing an experience that defied conventional explanation. Steve Harvey, known for his quick wit and his ability to handle any situation, stood genuinely at a loss for words, his face showing a mixture of emotions including sympathy, confusion, and something that looked like awe. Steve finally spoke. Colonel Chen, I do not even know what to say to that. That is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever heard anyone say on this stage. Tell me about your daughter. Tell me about Emily. Marcus's expression softened at the mention of his daughter's name. Emily was our middle child, born between our 2 sons. She was brilliant, kind, funny, and stubborn. She wanted to be a doctor. She volunteered at hospitals. She studied constantly. She had been accepted to several excellent universities with scholarship offers. She was everything a father could hope for in a daughter. And then one night, a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car, and she died instantly. She was 16 years old, and her entire future disappeared in a moment. Marcus paused, collecting himself before continuing. The grief nearly destroyed our family. Jennifer and I barely held our marriage together. Our sons struggled terribly with losing their sister. I threw myself into my work, flying more missions than necessary because being in the cockpit was the only place I could focus on something other than the loss. I was not a good husband or father in the 3 years between Emily's death and the day I was shot down. I was just surviving, going through the motions, feeling empty inside. And then I found myself in that valley in Afghanistan, injured and alone and facing capture or death, and I heard Emily's voice. Not a memory of her voice, not imagination, but her actual voice speaking to me as clearly as if she were standing next to me. She said, "Dad, you need to move northeast and find the rocks. They are coming from the south." And I moved northeast and I found rocks and I hid, and minutes later I saw Taliban fighters moving through the area I had just left. Steve Harvey sat down on the edge of the stage, his legs apparently unable to support him while hearing this story. The audience watched in rapt attention. Marcus continued. For 4 hours, Emily's voice guided me. She told me when to move and when to stay still. She told me where enemy fighters were positioned. She told me to turn off my emergency beacon temporarily because fighters were using handheld equipment to track its signal. She told me to move to a specific ridge where the rescue helicopter would have clear approach. Every single thing she told me turned out to be tactically correct. When the rescue team finally reached me and I was being extracted, the pilot told me they had expected to find a body rather than a living pilot, because the area I was in was considered extremely dangerous with heavy enemy presence. He said I must have had incredible luck or divine intervention to survive 4 hours on the ground in that location. I told him it was my daughter. He smiled politely and said the medics would give me something for the pain. Steve found his voice, though it remained thick with emotion. What do you think happened, Colonel? How do you explain what you experienced? Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. I have spent 12 years thinking about this question, Mr. Harvey. I have considered every possible explanation, hallucination caused by stress and pain, my subconscious mind using Emily's voice to process my own tactical training and survival instincts, coincidence that the decisions I made happened to be correct, divine intervention, actual communication from my daughter's spirit. I have talked to psychiatrists, chaplains, fellow pilots, and people from various faith traditions. Everyone has their own explanation, and nobody can prove their explanation is correct. So I am left with what I know to be true from my own experience. I heard Emily's voice. I followed her guidance. I survived. Whether that was my mind protecting me through familiar sounds, or God working through my memory of my daughter, or Emily's actual spirit coming to save me, I cannot definitively say. What I can say is that my daughter saved my life that day, and I will believe that until I die. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, spoke up from her position with the family. Can I add something, Mr. Harvey? Steve nodded and Jennifer stepped forward. What Marcus has not told you is what happened after he got home from that deployment. After the rescue, after the debriefing, after the medical treatment, after the psychiatric evaluations, Marcus came home and he was different. The grief that had been consuming him for 3 years was still there, but it had transformed into something else. He started talking about Emily again, sharing memories we had all been avoiding because they hurt too much. He reconnected with our sons, really reconnected in ways he had not been able to do since Emily died. He became present in our lives again instead of being emotionally absent. He said that hearing Emily's voice in that valley, whether it was real or hallucination, had reminded him that she would want him to live fully, to be there for his family, to honor her by being the father and husband that he had been before she died. Jennifer continued, tears streaming down her face. So whatever actually happened in that valley in Afghanistan, whether it was spirits or psychology or divine intervention or some combination we cannot understand, the result was that I got my husband back, our sons got their father back, and we became a family again instead of 4 people living in the same house, but trapped in separate grief. That is what saved Marcus's life, not just in the immediate sense of surviving the shoot down, but in the larger sense of reclaiming his life from the grief that was killing him slowly. Emily saved her father in multiple ways that day. Steve Harvey wiped tears from his eyes and stood up, walking over to Marcus and pulling him into a tight embrace. The audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for several minutes while the Chen family stood together on stage, holding each other and crying together. When the applause finally subsided, Steve made an announcement. We are going to finish this game because that is what the Chen family came here to do, and I have a feeling that answer Colonel Chen just gave us about the voice of someone who is gone saving your life, that is probably on the board, even though it is unlike any answer I have heard in all my years hosting this show. Steve called for the board to reveal the remaining answer, and incredibly, the survey had captured something similar. The remaining answer was listed as Guardian Angel, worth 14 points, and Steve ruled that Marcus's answer was close enough to that concept to count. The Chen family won the round and advanced to fast money. Jennifer and Marcus competed together in the final round, both of them emotionally exhausted but focused, and they won the $20,000 by a comfortable margin. But before the episode concluded, Steve invited Marcus to share more about his experience and about his daughter Emily. Marcus talked about how the experience had changed his understanding of life and death, about how he now believed that the people we love do not entirely leave us when they die, that they remain connected to us in ways we might not always perceive, but that can become apparent in moments of extreme need. He talked about how he had joined support groups for bereaved parents after his experience, how he had shared his story with other grieving families, not to convince them of any particular explanation, but to offer hope that connection with lost loved ones might persist in forms we cannot always understand. He talked about how his experience had made him less certain about the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, how it had opened him to possibilities he would have dismissed before that day in the Afghan valley. The episode aired 8 weeks later as a special Veterans Day broadcast, and the response was extraordinary in its scope and intensity. The story of Marcus hearing his deceased daughter's voice while shot down in enemy territory reached hundreds of millions of people and generated intense conversation about grief, survival, spirituality, and the nature of consciousness. Some viewers interpreted Marcus's experience through religious frameworks, seeing it as proof of an afterlife and of divine intervention in human affairs. Others interpreted it psychologically, explaining that extreme stress can cause the mind to generate helpful hallucinations using familiar voices, and that Marcus's tactical training had been processed through the mental construct of his daughter's voice. Still others remained open to the mystery, acknowledging that some experiences defy easy categorization and that we may not have complete understanding of consciousness, connection, and what happens when we die. The response from the bereaved parent community was particularly powerful. Thousands of people who had lost children wrote to share their own experiences of feeling their child's presence, of hearing their voice, of sensing their guidance during difficult moments. Many expressed that Marcus's willingness to speak publicly about his experience had validated feelings and perceptions they had been reluctant to discuss for fear of being seen as delusional or unable to accept reality. Mental health professionals noted that the conversation sparked by Marcus's story helped normalize discussion of continuing bonds with deceased loved ones, a concept that modern grief therapy increasingly recognizes as healthy and normal rather than as pathological inability to let go. The military and veteran community also responded strongly, with many service members sharing their own experiences of inexplicable events during combat or survival situations. Some talked about hearing voices of deceased comrades giving warnings or guidance. Others described making decisions during combat that they could not later explain, but that had turned out to be life-saving. Many expressed appreciation that Marcus, as a highly trained and rational Air Force officer, had been willing to speak about an experience that could not be explained through conventional military training or protocol. The conversation expanded to include discussion of spirituality in military service, the role of faith and belief systems in survival, and the ways that service members process traumatic experiences through both rational and non-rational frameworks. Steve Harvey was profoundly affected by Marcus's story, returning to it repeatedly in interviews and on his various programs. He talked about how Marcus had challenged his own assumptions about the boundaries between the living and the dead, about how hearing that story had made him think differently about grief and loss and connection. Steve featured updates about Marcus and the Chen family on his show multiple times, and he used his platform to encourage open discussion about experiences that defy easy explanation. He emphasized that whether someone believed Marcus had actually heard his daughter's spirit or believed he had experienced a psychological phenomenon, the important point was that the experience had been real and meaningful to Marcus and had helped him heal from devastating grief. Marcus Chen became an unexpected advocate for bereaved parents and for open discussion of complicated grief experiences. He emphasized repeatedly that he was not trying to convince anyone of any particular explanation for what happened to him, that he understood his experience could be interpreted multiple ways, and that people should find explanations that aligned with their own beliefs and values. What he wanted to share was simply that connection with deceased loved ones could manifest in ways we might not expect, that grief does not always follow predictable patterns, and that healing sometimes comes through experiences we cannot fully understand, but that nonetheless transform us. He worked with several organizations supporting bereaved families, speaking at conferences and support group meetings, always telling his story honestly while acknowledging the mystery at its core. The Chen family, which had been fractured by Emily's death and slowly rebuilt after Marcus's shoot-down experience, grew even stronger in the years following their Family Feud appearance. Marcus and Jennifer celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by their extended family, including their 2 sons, their sons' wives, and 5 grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about the aunt they never met, but whose presence remained part of the family's collective consciousness. The grandchildren learned that Aunt Emily had saved their grandfather's life, and they grew up understanding that the people we love remain part of our lives even after death, that family bonds transcend physical presence, and that we honor the deceased by living fully and loving deeply. 10 years after the Family Feud episode, Marcus was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy about survival, loss, and leadership. He stood before a room full of young cadets who would soon be officers themselves, many of whom would face combat and all of whom would face loss at some point in their lives. He told them about that day in the Afghan valley, about hearing Emily's voice, about the 12 years since then spent trying to understand what happened. He acknowledged that some of them would dismiss his experience as hallucination, while others would embrace it as spiritual truth, and he told them both interpretations were valid. What he wanted them to understand was that survival sometimes requires openness to experiences that defy our training and our rational frameworks, that connection with others can take forms we do not expect, and that the people we love shape who we are in ways that persist long after they are gone. Marcus concluded his speech with a message that resonated deeply with the young officers preparing for service. When you face your moment of crisis, when you are tested beyond what you thought you could endure, you may find strength and guidance coming from unexpected sources. You may hear a voice that should not be there. You may feel a presence you cannot explain. You may make decisions that defy logic but that turn out to be correct. Do not dismiss these experiences as impossible. Remain open to mystery. Trust what you perceive even when others might doubt it. Because sometimes what saves our lives is not the equipment or the training, as important as those things are, but something deeper and more personal that connects us to the people we love and to forces we cannot fully comprehend. That openness, that willingness to experience the full mystery of existence, might be what keeps you alive when nothing else can. The cadets gave Marcus a standing ovation, and many approached him afterward to share their own questions about spirituality, grief, and the experiences they feared discussing because they seemed irrational or impossible. Marcus listened to each person with patience and respect, offering no definitive answers, but instead offering permission to hold complexity, to acknowledge mystery, and to trust their own experiences, even when those experiences could not be easily categorized or explained. He told them about Emily, showing pictures of the bright-eyed teenager who had wanted to be a doctor, sharing the reality that behind his survival story was a devastating loss that nothing could erase, but that somehow had transformed into something that gave him guidance when he needed it most. Marcus Chen lived to age 73, maintaining close relationships with his family and his fellow veterans until a heart attack took him peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, his sons shared the story of their father's shoot down and of hearing their sister Emily's voice guiding him to safety. They talked about how that experience had transformed their father and their entire family, how it had taught them about the persistence of love beyond death, and how it had shown them that the people we lose remain with us in ways we might not always perceive, but can trust nonetheless. The service concluded with a flyover by F-16 fighters from Marcus's old squadron, the missing man formation honoring a pilot who had served with distinction and who had taught so many people about courage, survival, and the mysterious ways that love manifests across the boundaries we think separate the living from the dead. If Marcus Chen's story moved you, if his testimony about hearing his deceased daughter's voice challenged your assumptions about what is possible, if you believe that love and connection transcend physical death, even if we cannot fully explain how, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with anyone who has experienced grief, with anyone who has had experiences they could not explain, with anyone who needs permission to trust what they perceive even when it seems impossible. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences of connection with deceased loved ones or of moments when you received guidance from sources you could not identify. Let us create a community that honors mystery rather than demanding explanations for everything, that acknowledges the limitations of our understanding while remaining open to experiences that transcend those limitations. Marcus showed us that survival can depend on factors that defy our training and our rational frameworks, that the voices of those we love can guide us even after death, and that being open to that guidance might be what saves us when nothing else can. Harvey froze that day not because he did not believe Marcus, but because Marcus's testimony was so profound and so honest that it demanded a pause, a moment of silence in which to recognize that some truths are so deep and so personal that they stop us in our tracks and force us to reconsider what we think we know about life, death, and the connections that bind us to the people we love. Subscribe and share to honor all those who have lost loved ones, to support those who have had experiences they fear discussing because those experiences seem impossible, and to affirm that love persists beyond death in ways we may not fully understand but can nonetheless trust and be guided by. Because somewhere there is someone who needs to hear that their perception of a deceased loved one's presence is not delusion, but connection, that the voice they hear is real even if others cannot hear it, and that being guided by love across the boundary of death is not impossible, but is perhaps one of the most human experiences we can have. Thank you for being part of this community that honors both the explicable and the mysterious, that makes space for experiences that defy easy categorization, and that trusts in the power of love to transcend even death itself.